Canada's journey to independence, it's not a story of one big bang. It's more of a slow burn, this gradual evolution that really unfolded over more than a century. Today, we're going to dive into this really unique story of how a nation was built, not through a revolution, but through this patient, piece-by-piece process. So, let's start with a question that totally flips the script on how we usually think about nation building. We often imagine independence being won through war and rebellion, right? But Canada's story, it offers a completely different model, a different way of becoming a country. If you're intrigued by historical stories that kind of break the mold, you are definitely in the right place. Help us explore more of these unique narratives by liking and subscribing. Now, let's get into what makes Canada's story so incredibly different. Okay, so there are basically two paths to nationhood. On one side, you've got the revolutionary model, that sharp, often violent break, like the American War of Independence. And on the other side, you've got the Canadian path, a gradual evolution, a piece-by-piece transfer of power. It's less about a single declaration and way more about a long, negotiated coming of age. So where does this whole evolutionary journey begin? Well, our first major milestone is the birth of the Dominion of Canada. Back in 1867, the Constitution Act united several British colonies into this new thing called a dominion. But you have to understand, this wasn't independence, not even close. Think of it like a teenager moving into the basement apartment. Yeah, Canada could now manage its own internal affairs, but Britain, the parent, still held the master keys and had the final say on all the big decisions. And the reason for this move? It wasn't some big push for separation from Britain. Nope. It was a totally practical decision made by colonists who were still deeply loyal to the crown. They needed to create a stronger economic union and, this is a big one, a united front against their very large and sometimes aggressive neighbor to the south. So let's look at the fine print of this arrangement, right? Canada couldn't change its own founding document. That had to be done in London. British laws could still be imposed on Canada, and the final court of appeal for any major legal dispute? All the way over in the UK. This was self-rule for sure, but with some very, very significant strings still attached. Now, this delicate balance started to shift, and shift dramatically in the early 20th century. It was accelerated by the crucible of war and a really bizarre political crisis at home. This is where Canada truly began to forge its own identity. The First World War was an absolutely defining moment. Hundreds of thousands of Canadians served, and over 60,000 of them died. This immense sacrifice for a war that was being directed from London forced Canadians to see themselves not just as subjects of an empire, but as a nation in their own right. Prime Minister Robert Borden really embodied this shift. He began the war as a staunch supporter of the British Empire, but after watching his country bleed on European battlefields, he completely transformed. He started demanding that if Canada was going to make such a huge sacrifice, it deserved a say in how the war was run. And his pressure led directly to the creation of the Imperial War Cabinet, giving Canada a seat at the big table for the very first time. Meanwhile, back home, a constitutional crisis erupted that laid bare the limits of Canada's autonomy. So Prime Minister Mackenzie King, he's about to lose a vote in Parliament, and he asks the Governor-General, Lord Byng, to call an election. But Byng, who's an appointed British official, just says, no. It was a bombshell. The political fallout was messy, but the real takeaway was the shock that one man, representing the crown, could overrule a democratically elected prime minister. This whole affair became a direct catalyst, fueling the argument that Canada needed to be master of its own political house. All this momentum from the war and the King-Byng affair, it all culminated in the next huge step. The Statute of Westminster in 1931 was a total game-changer. This was an act passed by the British Parliament itself, declaring that Canada was now legislatively independent and equal in status to Britain. For the average Canadian, this meant the laws governing their daily lives would now, for the most part, be made only in Canada by Canadians. And this moment was so significant that it's still commemorated today. The Royal Union flag is flown on federal buildings each year to mark the anniversary of this pivotal act. A little nod to the old relationship, even as a brand new one was being forged. But even after 1931, one final, crucial link in that colonial chain remained. And this brings us to the final and maybe the most dramatic chapter in this entire story. So, get this. Canada was now a nation, equal in status to Britain, but with a critical piece missing. It still couldn't perform the most basic function of a sovereign state, changing its own constitution without asking another country for permission. This was the final hurdle that Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau was determined to overcome in the early 1980s. And what followed was a political firestorm. Trudeau wanted to patriate the Constitution, basically bring it home, and add a powerful Charter of Rights and Freedoms. But 8 of the 10 provincial premiers, who became known as the Gang of Eight, fought him tooth and nail, fearing a loss of their own power. The battle raged all the way to the Supreme Court, which delivered this mixed verdict that just led to a stalemate. The standoff was finally broken in a dramatic, all-night negotiating session that has become legendary in Canadian politics, known as the Kitchen Accord. But that breakthrough came at a steep cost. The final deal was made while the Premier of Quebec was not in the room. This exclusion created a deep political wound in Quebec, where the event is still referred to as the Night of the Long Knives. And honestly, it has shaped Canadian politics ever since. Despite the controversy, though, the deal was done. And all that remained was the final, formal act that would complete Canada's long journey. And here it is. No cannons, no battles. On a cool spring day in Ottawa, Queen Elizabeth II, as the Queen of Canada, and Prime Minister Trudeau sat at a table and signed a piece of paper. And with that simple act, just a stroke of a pen, the last legal tie was severed. And this new constitution? It was profound. It finally gave Canada the power to amend its own supreme law. It entrenched a powerful Charter of Rights and Freedoms, fundamentally changing the relationship between the citizen and the state. And critically, it recognized and affirmed the rights of Canada's Aboriginal peoples. So let's just recap this incredible 115-year journey. You start with the limited self-rule of 1867, then finding a voice on the world stage in 1917, gaining legal independence in 1931, becoming its own final court of appeal in 1949, and finally achieving full sovereignty in 1982. Each step was a deliberate, negotiated move towards the next, building sovereignty piece by piece by piece. And this brings us to a final thought. You know, Canada's story of independence wasn't written in blood, but in ink. It was built through debate, negotiation, and legislation. It really makes you wonder, what does it truly mean to build a nation? Not in a single revolutionary moment, but through a patient, deliberate process, one law at a time. If this explainer gave you a new perspective on the Canadian story, let us know down in the comments. History really does live through conversation, so please like, subscribe, and share to keep it going. Thanks for watching.